You have to wonder about a show whose off-screen conflicts are more compelling than the expensively rendered CGI on-screen conflicts. The Rings of Power is lacking in magic, shot through with grating identity politics, bereft of compelling characters, and defined more by style than substance. Here are the 5 main reasons The Rings of Power fails. Before I get started, I'm coming up on 2,000 subscribers, and if you've ever thought about subscribing to the channel before, or you like my content, then maybe think about subscribing now, or even sharing some of the videos. It'll help out a lot. Number 1. A lack of magic. By this, I don't mean the spells and visions of the fantasy genre. I mean the fundamental sense of magical storytelling. J.R.R. Tolkien was able to craft stories that have captured the imaginations of readers for generations with their scope and richness. These screenwriters, starting with whatever scraps they were able to obtain the rights to, have had to fill in the gaps using their own aptitude as storytellers. Having the name The Lord of the Rings in the title guarantees a certain degree of interest and carries with it a vast amount of prestige, but few, if any, of the credited writers can claim to have been involved in projects of genuine originality or longevity. Then name recognition alone isn't going to result in something with genuine magic to it, no matter how glittering the CGI landscapes, plush the costumes, or dynamic the choreography of the fight scenes. The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, is an insubstantial, poorly crafted substitute for something original. It is what I call ersatz culture. Ersatz means a substitute good, especially one that is considered inferior to the good it replaces. It generally means that the substitution is of unsatisfactory or inferior quality compared with the real thing. Think instant coffee over freshly ground beans, or cheap margarine in place of butter. Or Harry Styles' dresses and pearls 30 years after the boundary-pushing androgyny of David Bowie. 2. The boringly overpowered heroine. There's a pattern with modern heroines that really came to the fore more than half a decade ago with Captain Marvel and Rey Skywalker. The conventions are 1. Dispense with a traditional character arc or stick to the bare rudiments of one, because in this modern prevailing culture, rather than have super awesome heroines start off humble, lacking in agency, and having character flaws in a way that might humanize them and make them sympathetic and have us invested in their journey of growth, it seems much more fulfilling to simply have them awesome and fabulous from the get-go. Morally perfect, resourceful, able to physically match or overpower male contemporaries or antagonists, and able to immediately control or influence the course of events. When this happens, you feel a grating sense of the writers going through a process of wish fulfillment, of vaingloriously wanting to create marvelous heroines who are, or will quickly become, practically infallible. If they are given some semblance of character flaws, it is not really flaws in their nature or personality, rather a boiling over of their frustrations arising at their constraint within a society that disrespects and overlooks them. The dispensing with the conventions of a hero's journey character arc makes the characters plainly kind of boring, because they are more projections of ideals than believable people who you can root for. The sense of the screenwriters getting a kick out of their own boldness and audacity pervades the whole experience of watching these characters. These latent and half-conscious pinches and scuffs of the writer's intentions becomes grating, and rather than it being an uplifting experience, the overall impression and response is a kind of emptiness. There is a direct correlation between the extent to which these heroines are overpowered and their male counterparts on screen are made less compelling. The men basically fall into a clutch of unlikable categories. The sanctimonious and taunting male figure who the young heroine has to contend with, and who becomes or who represents a kind of metaphor or proxy for the idea of a cynically dominating male world.
Even you couldn't possibly believe their old scrap will float.
Second are the kind of nobody beta male characters who tee up ineffective ideas and represent the status quo, which the heroine can then knock down with much more sophisticated and empowering counter-arguments as a means to show her natural and inherent leadership skills. Third, the weaklings and deserters, the men who, having all the entitled trappings of power, armor, weapons, titles, are revealed in moments of crisis to be inadequate, to falter, placing more pressure on the heroine to claim the narrative spotlight and excel. Lastly, there are the patrician-like dignified older men at the highest levels of power who, having authority, can nonetheless be undermined by having actually little agency, whilst the heroine is the one who goes on the quests, changes the political or military environment through her exploits, and proves herself despite her status. 3. Dialogue. Shows set in fantasy worlds or in classic ages tend to have language that we would associate with those contexts. Language that is suffused with classic rhetoric, formal constructions, elaborate and rich verbal textures. It's actually really hard trying to do pseudo-versions of that kind of classical tone. It can be excruciatingly painful if done by amateurs who haven't studied or practiced it and who try to approximate it and add a dollop of philosophy or poignant analogies when they're not really equipped to do so. It means the language comes across as a lame attempt at seeming fancy and profound.
A ship floats, and a stone cannot. Because the stone sees only downward.
If the characters themselves aren't particularly interesting and their motivations are fairly conventional or dull, then trying to puff up their language to make them seem debonair or wise is like pulling teeth in a show like this. 4. Spectacle over substance. Much has been made of the impressive CGI in this show, conjuring up extraordinary landscapes lit with sheer sunlight and showcasing sprawling citadels, principalities, and townships. It's also no secret that each episode has clocked in at an opulent 50 million or so. The issue here is that what matters most, the actors, are often subsumed into the spectacle, due in part to their lack of charisma and on-screen presence, and the lack of any particular well-recognized names. Viggo Mortensen, as Aragorn, was able to emote an extraordinary range from the first film, as an ostracized and uncertain figure, through to the distinguished and fully realized character at the end of The Return of the King. His range could encompass empathy, self-doubt, raw courage, moral authority, and conviction. Christopher Lee was able to project a chilly sense of malice. Martin Sokus, as Celeborn, was able to balance the ethereal and fey quality of an elf with an inherent stoic masculine presence. None of these actors and actresses in The Rings of Power are especially compelling. The more obstinately that Galadriel is portrayed as physically and morally infallible, the less depth of character she has, because the character is in many ways bereft of subtlety, which is derived from such crucial human traits as self-doubt, ego, misplaced assumptions, and all the other things that go to make up a character who can grow, evolve, and prevail in satisfying ways. 5. A need to be epic. The feeling this show gives off is a need to measure up to the immense source material. It has to be suitably epic in scale. The show's main way of dealing with this is to have a show that massively sprawls. Surely a show could only be judged as epic if its plot threads are set across vast distances, lands, deserts, and oceans, with multiple storylines only really having a slight sense of convergence. Within an episode or two, we have lush woods and paddocks, turbulent oceans, and windswept freezing landscapes of snow and ice. However, being epic doesn't necessarily mean casting your story to the four winds. The original Lord of the Rings series ventured across multiple beautiful landscapes, but it was still restrained, at least for the first film, with its fellowship. This diverged in the second and third films, but we already had established character relationships and an overall sense of cohesion, where they would converge in various ways, often with the emotional satisfaction and release of seeing characters reunited because we cared about them, and we knew that they'd already been through lots of adventures together. And even through all the divergences of locations, there was still a through line that was quite simple. The ring being born, having to be transported to one location at the end in the fires of Mount Doom. It's quite possible the showrunners took many of their cues from Game of Thrones, and you could hardly judge them for that. Game of Thrones, however, had an inherent center of storytelling gravity in King's Landing. All storylines seemed to converge on that location, be it the spectral threats from the north, the emerging power of Daenerys in the east, and approaching military threats and intrigues from everywhere else. There was also consistent and clear-cut family at the heart of that narrative, where the Stark siblings were strewn across the entire landscape, but the entire story was bound by their family ties, giving cohesion and strong contours. The Rings of Power has turned out to be everything the Tolkien fanbase dreaded. Ersatz and lacking in magic, shot through with grating identity politics, lacking satisfying pace or sophisticated dialogue, bereft of compelling characters, and defined more by style than substance. It's just that awful modern thing. Content.